Hello and welcome to Story Rhyme with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read Part 5 of The Adventures of Rashleigh by James Tucker. The story is about a convict in Australia. In Part 4, Ralph was kidnapped by bushrangers and forced to cook for them and be their pack mule. We pick up after his close call with the gallows. Well, let's continue. Chapter 18. It was not until a second sessions had ended that Ralph Rashleigh was passed as fit to be sent to Newcastle. The day came, and he, with 130 other miserable men, were heavily ironed and linked to a long chain, and marched through the streets under a strong guard to the public wharf, where a small colonial coasting vessel named the Alligator was lying alongside. Side note: Governor Darling, under date July 26, 1831, to Viscount Goderic, in an official dispatch wrote, "The establishment at Newcastle has been totally reduced, with the exception of the men attached to the coal mines, and these will be immediately transferred to the Australian Agricultural Company, the agent having lately signified that he should shortly be prepared to receive them." An official return dated April 1st, 1827, gives the number of convicts employed in the Newcastle coal mines as 266. Back to the main text. The prisoners were marched aboard and stripped naked before being sent down into the hold, the floor of which had been spread with shingle ballast. As each man got below, he was secured by his fetters to a chain which was strongly fastened to the planking of the floor. It was impossible for the men to walk, or even to stand, the height from the floor of the hold to the upper deck being not more than 3½ feet, and the hold was so small that when all the prisoners had been crowded into it, they were squeezed so tight that they could only lie down upon their sides, body to body. The heat was intense, and the steam from the perspiring unfortunates rose through the hatchway in a cloud, as if the hold were afire. Rashleigh had read about the conditions obtaining in the slave trade, and knew now that the horrors which he had seen described could not have been exaggerated. His only consolation, as he lay there sweating and nauseated, was that as the voyage was only one of 100 miles, this torment and defilement would not last long. The Alligator weighed anchor and cleared harbour with a fair wind, but once out to sea, ran into a fresh gale in which she pitched violently, shipping water. The waves, breaking over the sides, washed through the hatchway into the hold, cooling the fevered wretches, but as the seas remained big, it was not long before the hold was awash, and the prisoners were obliged to kneel or crouch in order to keep their heads above water. The weather remained rough for several hours, until the captain was forced by a change of wind to put into Broken Bay, under his lee, where the pumps were got working and the hold made habitable again. The voyage lasted 48 hours, and during the whole time the ration for each man was half a mouldy biscuit and a drink of water. The 130 men remained fettered to the chains without a break of any kind, lying helplessly in their own excrement in a state which would have been considered insanitary for cattle. Filthy and stinking, the prisoners were at last landed at Newcastle, where they performed with joy the compulsory ablutions in the sea, after which their clothing was served out to them. They were then paraded and inspected by the military commandant, a man of such ruthless severity that he had earned the title of King of the Coal River. The inspection over, the men were broken into groups and dispatched to various places of labour, Rashleigh, with 70 others, being drafted for employment in the old coal mine, so called to distinguish it from another shaft which had recently been sunk. Side note: James Muddy of Castle Forbes, New South Wales, from 1822 to 1836, made the following statement before the Select Committee on Transportation in 1837. Chairman: at what period are you speaking of? James Muddy: I should think it must be about 1825 to 26. Newcastle had then ceased to be a penal settlement, but there was an individual there who acted as what they call a commandant. He was a military officer, I was walking upon the jetty one Sunday morning, and this commandant came down. He was going into a boat to go up the river. One of the men was absent. He inquired where he was, and they said he had just gone a little way. In fact, the man was then in sight, and came up running, when the commandant abused the man, and called him a damn scoundrel, and said, "Where have you been? And why were you not in attendance?" And he kicked him, and in fact knocked him down. And he then ordered them to send for the flogger to flog him. The people at that time in church, and it occasioned a considerable deal of talk. He ordered the man to be flogged, and he was flogged. Back to the main text. A grim-visaged overseer received them at the pit head, and called his clerk to take the likenesses of the new victims of his oppression. The clerk was a miserable, half-starved, brow-beaten creature, who did his duty trembling with fear at the threats of his superior. After which the men were lowered singly in a bucket to the bottom of the shaft. Rashleigh gazed into the gloom, full of wonder at the strangeness of the scene. 7 low passages opened out from the space at the foot of the shaft, dimly lit by small lamps. But at the end of each tunnel was a blaze of light. In the glow, like some glimpse of inferno, he saw groups of men working feverishly, who redoubled their exertions at sight of the hated overseer, who had brought down the new hands. As this brute stepped out of the bucket, he criticised the manner in which a wagon had been filled by a gang who had just dragged it along to be unloaded. Cursing and abusing them, he set upon the men in charge with a stout cudgel, and in a few moments had knocked every man down, and then beaten them until they rose again, driving them back to refill the wagon down the passage along which they had just come. He came back, out of breath, and, dividing the newcomers up into parties of 16, gave each gang a wagon. He then led the way along one of the galleries into a great open space where large coal fires were burning, by the light of which, added to that of their lamps, miners were busy hacking out masses of coal. The overseer stopped at an immense heap and called the overseer in charge of this section. "Take these new chums in hand and set 'em on," he ordered shortly. Their work was to fill the wagons with coal, drag them to the opening at the shaft's foot, and tip out the contents according to the directions of the man in charge there. They set to work immediately, and continued without rest under the blows and threats of their taskmaster until night, when each man received a small portion of boiled maize grain, a morsel of salt beef, and water. They slept naked in any part of the workings, the heat being so excessive that any clothing or covering only added to the misery of life. No bedding was provided, but those who were not exhausted to make the effort could scrape together enough dust to make a comfortable sleeping place. The convict miners remained underground the whole week, and on Saturday afternoons were taken to the surface to wash themselves and their clothing in sea water. When their clothes were dry, they were marched to the convict barracks and confined there until Monday morning. Bathing in the sea on his first Saturday afternoon, Rashleigh noticed that there was scarcely one of the older miners whose backs or buttocks were free from marks of the lash. He remarked to one of the men that it seemed as if punishment was plentiful at Newcastle. "Aye, that's something there's no lack of anyway," answered the miner with a laugh, "and so you will know soon, for tomorrow is payday." Rashleigh asked no more questions, and soon, with about 500 others, he was marched off and shut up in a great room in the barracks, where they were left to pass the night on the floor. At dawn on Sunday, the hoarse shouts of the barrack officer aroused the men, who were turned out into the yard and drawn up around a series of triangles, used for securing men who were to be flogged. A clerk sat at the table, and 4 scourgers stood beside the triangles, each with a number of whips laid out on a bench. The significance of this muster was clear to Rashleigh, and he waited dejectedly while the clash of arms and the roll of a drum heralded the approach of the commandant. An opening was made in the ranks of the convicts, and the official, dressed in full regimentals, attended by the sergeant's guard, marched in and took his seat at the table. "Dash my old duds," whispered a fellow next to Rashleigh. "Look out, my lads. The cove has got on his fighting jacket, so it's going to be a regular field day." The clerk opened his book, and the overseer of the miners was called. He made a loutish reverence to the commandant, and handed in his punishment list. "Charlie's chatty," shouted one of the scourgers, acting as announcer. A little duck-legged Londoner stood forward. "What's he been doing?" demanded the commandant. "Neglecting his work, Your Honour," answered the overseer. 100 lashes." The little cockney was stripped and tied to one of the triangles, while 3 other convicts were tried in as many minutes, and triced up to the other triangles, naked. At a signal, the drummer began to tap his drum slowly, marking time for the lashes, inflicted by the strongest men among the convicts who had sunk low enough to volunteer for the office of flagellators. These men were held in contempt and execration by their fellow convicts, and distrusted by the authorities, who always ordered a constable to stand behind each scourger with orders to lay on lustily with a stick if the scourger seemed to relax in the severity of the lashes which he laid on to the culprit at his triangle. The orgy of punishment continued hour after hour, until not less than 50 men had been lashed, none with less than 75 stripes. The commandant taking obvious pleasure in stimulating the jaded scourgers with threats of punishment. When some time after 9 o'clock the convicts were dismissed, they were served with breakfast of boiled corn and half a pound of indifferently cured meat, which comprised the full daily allowance of each man. Rashleigh observed that, in these so-called examinations, the ceremony of the oath was dispensed with, and that the poor wretches charged with crimes were not so much as called upon for their defence. The convict overseers simply stated their complaints, which were assumed thereupon to be proved, and sentence of lashes was automatically passed. Justice and humanity were alike denied them. For another week, Rashleigh continued his gruelling task of loading and carting coal below, goaded by blows and threats from the overseers. Came up with the rest on Saturday, and witnessed the infliction of 4,000 lashes on the Sunday. The 3rd week he was transferred to a party whose job was to deliver at the pit's mouth daily a stated quantity of coal, and failing delivery, to be flogged until they reached the required standard. He passed 9 unvarying months of miserable toil, receiving in all 650 lashes for offences mainly invented by the caprice of his overseers, until he was, at the usual Sunday ceremony, held before the commandant, charged by the principal overseer of the mine with incorrigible laziness. By custom, and without any opportunity of defence, he received 100 lashes, and was ordered to be sent on the following day to work naked in the lime burners' gang across the river. Side note: James Muddy of Castle Forbes, New South Wales, from 1822 to 1836, made the following statement before the Select Committee on Transportation in 1837. Chairman: what was the punishment for criminals at the penal settlement at Newcastle? James Muddy: independent of flogging, they had a place they called the lime burners, about a mile from Newcastle, across the river, on the opposite side of the River Hunter. There the men of the worst description were sent to burn lime. They used to pick shells upon the beach and burn lime, and these men it would be impossible to describe in consequence of the depravity of their appearance. You cannot conceive anything like it. I went there merely as a matter of curiosity to see them, but that rested entirely with the commandant. If a convict overseer went to him and complained of a man and told him he could make nothing of him, in fact, if he got up a complaint against him and recommended him to be sent to what is called the lime burners, then he was sent there as a matter of course. Back to the main text. while Rashleigh was spending the remainder of the day in the charge of a jailer. An incident occurred which emphasised the sadistic brutality of the Commandant, who had condemned him, and revealed the despotism which governed the lives of the convicts at Newcastle. The Commandant was allotted 6 milch cows for the supply of his household, and it was customary to give the buttermilk to the pigs. He employed a young convict boy, whose work was to supply Government House with fuel, and the young scamp had formed the habit of waiting about until the skimmed milk was poured into the troughs and joining the swine in drinking it, the milk being a luxury compared with the normal convict diet. The pigs began to get lean, while the lad grew fat and round as a butt, and the Commandant's lady suspected that the milk was surreptitiously diverted from her animals. She therefore began to carry the milk to the troughs herself, but, assured though she now was that the food reached the pigs, they failed nevertheless to thrive. It was on this last day of Rashleigh's last punishment as a miner that accident gave solution to the mystery. The Commandant, returning from his flagellations, was arrested by an outcry in the pigsty, and looked over the fence to see what was wrong. There he saw someone lying full length in the sty, alternately lapping up the swill and keeping off an angry sow with vigorous kicks. The Commandant went purple with anger, and raced off to the house, called for his wife to come after him, and rushed back to the piggery. He was so out of breath with exertion that when his wife joined him, he could only point at the prone figure of the young thief, lying there, still in oblivious enjoyment of his meal. "Oh, you scoundrel!" screamed the lady, and as the detected lad raised his head, the Commandant roared out for a constable to fetch the scourges. In a very few minutes, 6 men carrying their cats and triangles hastened to the spot. Jack, the culprit, was immediately tied up. "Give him 100, roared the Commandant. "Aye," he added, as the scourger prepared to lay on after having taken off only the boy's frock. "Take off his shirt as well, damn you." He then ordered another flogger to stand behind the first, with orders to lash the scourger if he did not do his duty thoroughly. Jack endured the first 400 or 500 lashes without wince or cry, and the Commandant fairly danced with rage. "Harder, sir, harder yet," he roared, and ordered the second scourger to flog the first. Still the fuel boy endured his punishment in silence, at which the Commandant seemed to go quite mad. He ordered a third scourger to flog the second, still without effect upon the boy's grit, and in the end he had 6 scourgers in a file, scourging each other and the lad, while he himself lashed at the 6th man with his riding whip. These extraordinary circumstances prevented any one from counting the number of lashes, and the brutal comedy only ended when the King of Coal River dropped his whip from exhaustion. The wood boy was forthwith sentenced to work with the lime burners, where he met Rashleigh and told him the tale. Next morning, in fulfilment of his sentence, Rashleigh was stripped naked, except that he was allowed to wear part of his shirt as a decency shield, and was loaded with another pair of leg irons, in addition to those which had manacled him since his arrival at Newcastle. He was placed on board a lime punt, in charge of a constable, and transferred to the north shore of the Coal River, a sterile and forbidding tract made up of hummocks of sand scantily patched with couch grass and stunted bushes. The naked misery of the lime burners was even more extreme than that of the miners, on whose side of the river the Baroness was at least relieved by 1 or 2 gardens. The lime burners' camp consisted of 2 lines of hovels, enclosed by a tall palisade made of strips of the outer coat of the cabbage palm. The convicts here were the exiles and outcasts of the criminals from whose ranks they were derived, only the weak, the vicious, and the untamable being sent here from the horrors of Newcastle. As Rashleigh arrived, they were busily employed loading boats with marine shells, which were burned. but not slaked, for making lime. This loading was done by means of baskets which were filled and carried through the surf on the convicts' backs to the boats, into which the shells were tipped. Rashleigh was at once given a basket and ordered to join the rest. He appealed to the overseer to be allowed to do some other kind of work, urging the soreness of his back, raw from 100 lashes yesterday, as an excuse for his request. The overseer affected sympathy and asked to be shown the sore place, and when Rashleigh gingerly peeled off the piece of rough rag which he had secured as a dressing, the brute in charge flung into a handful of quicklime and cut him sharply across the spot with his stick. "Get to your work, you blasted crawling caterpillar," he shouted, "or I'll soon serve you 10 times worse than that." Rashleigh took up his basket and waded out into the salt water, which set the lime sizzling in his festering wound, while the brine seemed to eat into the raw cuts left by the lash. Almost mad with the pain, he was nevertheless kept steadily on the run until about 10 o'clock at night, when the last of the boats were loaded, and the worn-out, hungry wretches, who had been in and out of the water at this work for 16 hours, were at last allowed to go to their comfortless hovels and rest. 1 or 2 of the 150 men had somehow managed to make themselves bedding of dried seaweed, but the vast majority slept on hard wooden slabs, which were the substitute for beds. The living conditions of the emaciated wretches who were condemned to work at the lime burners' camp were incredibly severe at this time. The only clothing which was permitted did not vary in the heat of summer or the bitterness of winter, and consisted of the rag apron worn for the sake of decency. Every man wore not less than 2 sets of leg irons. Many had 4 and 6, as punishment for excessive delinquencies, and at all hours, governed only by the state of the tides, they were compelled to work breast high in the sea in order to unload their baskets in the boats, which drew about 3 to 4 feet of water. In the summer, their bodies were peeled of skin, and in the winter they were frozen and frostbitten, huddling together at night on the floor of their sleeping hovels in order to generate some warmth. Their weekly allowance of food was 3½ pounds of maize in cob, an all equal weight of ill-cured salt beef, and even this was reduced by the commissariat overseers, who stole freely from the common stock. The convicts were powerless to complain of these peculations by their immediate superiors, who held the power to punish them with lawless fury. There were no stated hours for labour, it being a compulsion on the overseers to work the men as long as they could be made to stand, and it was usual for the convicts to be driven for 15 hours a day. The crown of the lime burners' misery, however, was the treatment meted out to them on the periodical visits of the commandant of the district during his tours of the outstations. Rashleigh had learned at Newcastle the almost insane devotion to this despot to the infliction of pain upon the wretches under him, and he guessed that the severity of punishment would increase on this side of the river, inhabited as it undoubtedly was by the most incorrigible ruffians in the ranks of the convicts. The commandant always came with 2 scourgers, each of whom carried 3 or 4 cat-o'-nine-tails, and his method on arrival was to go from one working party to another, pick out any poor exhausted devil who was working less industriously than his mates, tie him to the nearest fence, and have him lashed with never less than 50 strokes. Their backs running with blood, his victims were at once ordered to resume their work. To Rashleigh it seemed that this man's temper was completely perverted. Scenes and sounds which aroused pity and loathing in any ordinary man were a source of fiendish delight to him, and it was a habit of his suddenly to spring at the scourger and belabour him with his riding whip in order to make him flog the tired convict with harder blows. His especial pleasures was to select men from the boat-loaders' gangs, and have them flogged until their backs were raw, so that he could enjoy the sight of the writhings and the sound of the shrieks as he compelled them to place their baskets of lime on their bleeding backs and wade out in the stinging salt water. His eyes would dilate with satisfaction at the pain caused by the lime slaking in the blood of the wounds. Several times during his stay there, Rashleigh saw men drown themselves before the eyes of their torturer, whose comment was always to the effect that it would save the government rope and the hangman a job. This particular commandant was, in a sense, a victim of the system of extreme corporal punishment, which was in common practice during that period. Flogging was a recognised form of punishment in the army and navy, and it was not many years since the sentence of flogging a seaman round the fleet had been abolished. He had almost certainly been selected for his present post by reason of his record as one of the most effective disciplinarians in the army, and apart from his unnatural joy in witnessing these floggings, he sincerely believed that the only sure means of controlling the 2,000 desperadoes under his charge was to break their bodies as well as their minds. His principle was to terrorize them, and he never hesitated, when an insufficient number of delinquents were paraded, to select promiscuously numbers of unoffending convicts, whom he thrashed in anticipation of crimes they were, in his view, almost certain to commit in the future. His method was in most cases successful. The men of the lime burners' camp were always existing just above starvation line, were continuously worked beyond their debilitated strength, and their minds were steadily brutalized by the punitive system which controlled their every minute. In 3 months, the vast majority were successfully broken in strength and cowed in spirit, shells of humanity governed by an overmastering instinct for food. Many men were perpetually wailing and weeping for food, devouring anything masticable, and on more than one occasion Rashleigh saw poor wretches picking out grains from the excrement of oxen, devouring the sullied food with eagerness. There was danger for any man who was fortunate enough to receive a soft bone with his meat allowance. The greedy, envious eyes of his companions would watch him as he voraciously ground it in his teeth, and, when his jaws wearied, he flung down a portion of the bone. There would be a wild scramble for it. On the second day of his internment, Rashleigh learnt how terrible a thing hunger could be. He had flung down a bone, and in a scuffle that ensured for its possession, 2 men grabbed different ends of the bone, and as neither would admit that the other had priority of claim, Rashleigh was asked to decide who should have it. He suggested dividing it, but the famished wretches would not agree, and at last he decided in favour of one of them. The man who had lost the bone, looking murder at Rashleigh, and the man with the prize fell away from the group, while the possessor partly crushed the bone between 2 stones, and sat down with his back to a shed and began to gnaw it. Rashleigh stared at the man in pity, wondering how long it would be before he were reduced to a similar state of bestial acquisitiveness, when he saw the second man standing over the eater with a great iron shell rake raised ready to strike. Rashleigh shouted a warning and sprang forward to prevent the blow, but was too late. As he sprang, the rake crashed on to the head of the unsuspecting man with a force which crushed the skull and spattered the brains around. "Aha! I've got it now!" cried the murderer, snatching up the half-gnawed bone, covered with the blood and brains of his victim, cramming it into his mouth, and holding out his hands to the overseer, who came running up to handcuff him. His hunger was appeased for the moment. What did punishment of hanging matter? Rashleigh was appalled to learn, on questioning his mates about this episode, that such atrocities were by no means rare, and one of the men who had come over with him on the ship from England warned him never to save any portion of his food for another meal, as there were many among the older, brutalized convicts who would not hesitate to kill him for a handful of maize or a bit of rotten meat. One day, soon after this incident, Rashleigh was out with a gang cutting timber for fuel for the lime kilns, when one of the oxen yoke to a fuel cart fell down from exhaustion. The driver tried with blows and curses to make it get up, but the emaciated beast was beyond responding to either, and was unyoked and left to die, the remaining ox dragging the cart to the kilns. Rashleigh and the rest of the gang had watched from their concealment in the scrub, and no sooner was the cart out of sight than they rushed forward, killed the beast outright with their axes, and cut away every eatable part of the carcass. They quickly concealed the meat and cleaned their axes before the overseer arrived with the bullock driver, and looked on with glee at the astonishment of the two men, who found only the head, feet and entrails remained of what half an hour before had been a whole if lean ox. All search failed to reveal the hiding place of the meat, and no proof could be discovered that Rashleigh's gang had had anything to do with the theft, and they were thus able to enjoy the luxury of chewing the raw, tough meat surreptitiously for days. Rashleigh, before he had been broken by these dreadful conditions, used to wonder why the convicts did not concert together in a mutiny, even if the attempt should mean the death of many of them, rather than endure this existence, than which death could not be worse. Suicide, except by drowning under the maddening pain of lime and sea water in raw wounds, was an unknown here, as it had been in the harsh but less terrible conditions on Emu Plains. The men, desperate in misery as they were too broken in spirit either to mutiny or make away with themselves. The only manifestation of courage was that which resulted from men being driven nearly mad by hunger. His guarded inquiries as to the chances of fomenting a mutiny speedily taught him that one great factor against possible success was that there was an utter lack of mutual trust among the men. Schemes for escape were frequently planned, but nearly always, before the time for action came, one or other of the convicts in the plot would turn informer and denounce those who had trusted him. An informer could usually be sure of reward of some kind from the authorities, and it was a practice of some men to inaugurate attempts at escape, with the deliberate intention of betraying his comrades in the hope of himself being appointed overseer, or to some other easy post. Chapter 19. One day, shortly after the feast of the ox was ended, Rashleigh was one of a number of convicts who were sent to cut a quantity of mangrove timber, which was destined for Sydney to be used for the manufacture of stonecutters' mallets. The selection of the right growths made it necessary for the members of the party to separate and wander about in the swamp, frequently up to their necks in water, until they hit upon likely trees. In the course of this work, Rashleigh strayed right up to the bank of the river, where he was thrilled to see a boat which lay dry upon a low sandbank, canted a little on one side. He could see no one in or near the boat. This spot was hidden from observation by a projecting point of land, mangrove covered, so Rashleigh crept quietly forward and looked into the boat. He saw a man lying fast asleep in the bottom, and noticed that the interior of the small vessel was much roomier than he had guessed at first sight. There was room under each side of the half-decks for 2 or 3 people to sleep comfortably, and it seemed to be well stocked with provisions and other supplies. The mast, with the sail wrapped round it loosely, lay along the thwarts, and under the sail he saw the butts of several muskets. With a quickening of heartbeats, Rashleigh saw his chance to escape. Swiftly and unobtrusively, he went back and told some of his companions of the miraculous opportunity, and all of them decided to take the risk. The excitement seemed to warm their blood and to nerve their gaunt frames, as bright-eyed they followed Rashleigh to the spot where the boat lay, its occupant still asleep. Without pause, they heaved the boat off the bank into the water, drew up the anchor, and began at once to drift in the swift stream towards the harbour mouth. They stepped the mast and set the sail, which bellied in the fresh breeze, standing over towards the southern shore to place an island between themselves and the lime burners' camp. As soon as they had reached this cover, they awakened the boatman, who was terrified at finding himself surrounded by over half a dozen gaunt, moving skeletons, their naked bodies smeared with mud and filth, and their faces and heads overgrown with matted hair. One of the runaways, who had armed himself with a musket, ordered the poor fellow to strip, and his clothes were at once donned by another of the fugitives, named Roberts, who, knowing something of sailing, had been selected to navigate the boat. The remainder lay low below the gunwale, lest their nakedness should attract the attention of any observers, who would at once set the garrison in pursuit. The helmsman, judging that he was sufficiently far from the Limeburners' Bay, recrossed the harbour to keep as great a distance as possible between boat and settlement. The bells of the town began ringing for the convicts' dinner hour, and hearing them, the fugitive realised that most of the inhabitants of Newcastle would be indoors at their meals, as the boat sailed by the town, thus greatly reducing the danger of being seen. The wind remained favourable. In answer to the hail of questions from his supine companions, the helmsman was able to report that they were passing the wharf of the coal mines, and that everything seemed to be going well. Soon they were abreast of Nobby's Island, a bluff rock set almost centrally in the mouth of Hunter's River. "Blow, good breeze," muttered the steersman. "Another mile and all is safe." The excited man had scarcely spoken when "Boat ahoy!" was thundered out by someone on the island. Forgetting prudence in the anxiety of hearing the peremptory hail, two of the naked runaways raised themselves above the gunwale to see who was accosting them. The man on the island, a military officer on a seafowl shooting expedition, saw them and realised what was happening. "Haul down your sail," he roared, "or I'll fire into your boat." The fugitives paid no heed nor made any answer to this order and threat, the man at the helm holding the boat steadily on her course. "Hallo! Shore ahoy! Help! Mutiny!" As the officer shouted, he levered his fowling piece and fired, ineffectually as it proved, the shots spattering the water well astern. Concealment being now useless, the whole party stood up, and Rashleigh saw that the whole settlement was by this time in commotion. The report of the officer's gun had roused the sentries posted at the signal stations, who discharged their muskets, the sound of which brought the dreaded commandant at a run from Government House. He leapt on his horse and galloped down to the sea beach, where, Rashleigh judged by his gestures, he was characteristically cursing a party of men who were busily launching a boat, urging them to make better speed. A party of soldiers came down the hill at a run towards their chief officer, and Rashleigh saw another detachment, which had apparently made for the jail at the first alarm, make their way on the high ground behind Nobby's Island. Alarm bells were ringing continuously, and the two cannon which stood on the patch of green in front of Government House were hastily loaded and discharged at the boat, one of the balls whizzing by just above the mast, after which it appeared to ricochet from wave to wave, finally burying itself in the sand on the northern shore. As his gaze came back from following the course of the ball, Rashleigh noticed a small boat, containing two people, put off from the islet and start in pursuit of them. They were the officer who had first given the alarm, and evidently his servant, but it was clear that they had only one firearm with them, and that almost certainly the fowling piece which the officer had taken with him for duck shooting. The two men held on with the chase, either ignorant of the fact that the fugitives were fully armed, or pluckily indifferent to this handicap. Their boat, being smaller and built for speed, began to gain rapidly on the heavier one in which the convicts stood. 6 of them now armed with muskets, which they had found on board. Rashleigh hailed the officer and begged him, as he valued his life, to keep off and give up the chase, calling his attention to the 6 pieces levelled on his boat. The young ensign must have felt that he had gone too far to retract with honour, and his reply to Rashleigh's well-meant advice was to discharge his piece, hitting the steersman in the left arm, incapacitating it. The 6 armed convicts fired simultaneously, and the rash young soldier fell bleeding overboard. His servant had perforce to abandon the chase and devote himself to the rescue of his superior, so that the convicts were able to turn their attention to the other pursuers. The nearest of these was a whaleboat propelled by 16 oars and carrying also a large sail. Rashleigh was terrified at the speed she was making, and the certainty of escape, which had been buoying him up, began to dwindle. The commandant, bareheaded and mouthing curses and promises alternately, stood in the bows, a musket in his hand, which he brought to his shoulder every few minutes, as if he were able to contain his rage until he was within effective shooting distance of his quarry. He did not fire, however, contenting himself with shaking his fists at the convicts and hurling imprecations after them. 3 other boats were coming on, almost abreast, in the wake of the commandant's, all containing soldiers, and 2 of them carrying sails to help the oarsmen. The 3rd boat was quickly reorganized by the fugitives, by reason of its peculiar rig, as the dreaded pilot boat, known as the swiftest boat in Newcastle, a reputation it maintained now by rapidly overhauling the other pursuing boats. About 5 miles ahead, on the northerly course, which the runaway steersman was holding still, despite his wounded arm, was the extreme point of the land which forms the bay into which Hunter River empties itself. From this promontory, a chain of rocks stretched seaward for nearly a mile, visible at low tide and indicated by surf and breakers in roughish weather. This day the tide was full, but even to Rashleigh's inexperienced eye, the danger of the steersman holding to his course right into the teeth of the reef was obvious. Rashleigh, appalled at what seemed to be the inevitable consequences, turned and hinted to Roberts at the helm that a better course would be to hold out to the open sea. "I know best what I'm about," answered Roberts calmly. "I'm doing all for the best." Accepting this assurance, Rashleigh turned to see how the pursuers were faring, and noticed that the pilot boat paused for a few moments alongside the larger boat, took the commandant aboard, and then came on in pursuit again at a great pace. The breeze was steadily freshening as they got farther from the lee of the land, and the boiling surf of the reef was only a very short distance ahead, when suddenly Roberts roared out, "Lay down, every man!" He himself gave point to the urgency of his command by flinging himself upon the half-deck, retaining his grip of the tiller, and keeping his eye fixed on a hill that lay directly ahead in their course. A volley of musketry came from the pilot boat, some of the bullets tearing through the fugitive sails, followed by the voice of the commandant, thundering imperiously, "Strike your sail, you infernal scoundrels, and surrender, or we'll run you down." Roberts raised himself to his knee, gave the tiller to another man, whose musket he took, and looked carefully in the flint and priming. "Now, my lads," he said, "if we were once inside that reef we should be safe. There is but one passage through it, and I don't believe there is a man in any of those boats that knows the course except myself. We must stop that pilot boat somehow if we can. I'll aim at that damned tyrant in the bows, and the rest of you fire at the slings of her sails. If any of your shots tell, they must stop. Now say when you are ready." He waited until he got the signal that they were all ready. "Now, the slings, mind," he cried. "Let fly." As the smoke of the volley cleared, Rashleigh saw the brutal commandant stagger, drop his musket into the sea, and sink into the outstretched arms of an attendant boatman. The aftersail fluttered for a moment in the breeze, and then came down over the heads of the steersman and the soldiers standing in the stern sheets. The pilot boat yawed out of her course, which just saved her from piling up on a rock not an oar's length from her bows. The runaway boat was now in the thick of the breakers that leapt, foamed and lashed about her, and Rashleigh felt that the end had come. No boat could live through such a sea, with rocks a mere boat's breadth away on either hand. Roberts caught the tiller from his substitute, and steered her by a course taken from shore marks through the opening in the reef into comparative safety. On the left lay the mainland, On their right, the open sea, and at the relief which he felt, Rashleigh turned and spontaneously congratulated Roberts on his courage and masterly handling of the boat. The man replied with a smile, "We shall see directly how the soggers get through it, for, by George, they are going to try it on." Rashleigh turned and saw the 16-oared boat making for the opening in the reef, and could not but admire the courage of her crew, who pulled at their oars unflinchingly in the turmoil of surf. For a little the boat made good way through the passage. Then a wild cry rose from all aboard her, followed by the noise of crushing timbers as she was battered on the rocks. Pitiful cries for help filled the air above the noise of the breakers. Roberts looked sardonically across the boisterous tract of sea. "Aye," he said, as if to himself, "I thought some of you would cool your courage there." Then he sat himself down composedly, the tiller in his hand, and asked one of his companions to bind up the wound in his left arm, while Rashleigh looked back and watched the remaining boats come up and apply themselves to the rescue of the men in the water. When this was done, the settlement boats pulled round the reef to the open sea, but by the time they had rounded the reef they were scarcely visible to the convicts. Feeling now comparatively safe, they set about preparing a meal of the provisions with which the boat was plentifully stocked. The man who had been in charge of her told them that the boat had been equipped in Sydney for two wealthy gentlemen who had recently come from England to settle in the colony. They had been bound on a trip up Hunter River to select land and had gone ashore at Newcastle to spend the day with the Commandant, who had sent off his gig with the invitation as they were going up river. The convicts sat into the best meal that any of them had eaten for long, and then held a consultation as to what their future plans should be. It was at last agreed that they should run along the coast to the north, as Rashleigh remembered having read that Captain Bligh and his boat's crew had taken that course after the famous mutiny of the Botany, a British man-of-war in the South Seas. The convicts' hope was that they would reach one of the Dutch settlements in the Indian archipelago, where they hoped to pass for shipwrecked mariners. This plan was kept secret from their prisoner, whom they put ashore, directing him to follow the shore, which would bring him to the side of the harbour opposite Newcastle. Rashleigh found freedom so pleasant that he slept only an hour or two that night, preferring to sit in the stern with Roberts, talking over their plans and problems. After a while he persuaded Roberts to take a spell of sleep, and leave to him the steering of the boat. Before turning in, the steersman gave Rashleigh a rudimentary lesson in navigation, directing him to keep the boat's head towards a certain star, and to rouse all the men if the wind should alter or fall, and especially if any breakers appear. During those pleasant night hours, Rashleigh surveyed the probabilities of a successful outcome to their venturesome voyage. The example of Captain Bligh's exploit filled him with hope. What Bligh could do in an ill-provisioned open boat, they could most certainly do in a better found, half-decked vessel, well supplied with food and water, and carrying fishing tackle. They needed not to lose sight of land, and so could always obtain a fresh supply of water, should they run out of what they had aboard. There was, of course, the danger of armed pursuit by one of the government cutters, which frequently put in at Newcastle, and it was certain that the wounded commandant would employ every resource at his disposal to effect their capture. Again, it was questionable whether there was any safe passage through the great reef which shut them in this great inlet, and even if there was such a passage, it was not unlikely that pursuing boats might be waiting there to intercept them. At last Rashleigh wearied of the probabilities, and contented himself with enjoying his liberty while he had it. At dawn, having lost the star by which to steer, he called Roberts, who examined the shore carefully and the lofty mountains looming in the background. "We've made a capital run," he said gleefully. "We are beyond my knowledge of the coast, and that extends at least 100 miles north of Newcastle." As the light increased and the early haze dissipated, they saw that the pilot boat had continued the pursuit, and was now nearly abreast of them. on the far side of the reef, about 1.5 miles distant. Ahead, the thunder of breakers warned them that they were approaching the end of the inlet, and to add to their discomfiture, the breeze lessened rapidly and finally died away, leaving them in a dead calm. They pulled the boat into shoal water among mangrove bushes and anchored. The actions of the men in the pilot boat were disturbing. They had now taken to the oars and were rowing slowly along the reef, as if searching for a passage through it. The convicts, fearing that the pursuers might find a way in, took everything out of the boat and buried it in the sand above high water mark. Then, as Rashleigh's suggestion, they filled the boat and sank her in shallow water, having first unstepped the mast, by which device they hoped to puzzle the pursuers and possibly throw them altogether off the scent. Each man had retained a small stock of food, a musket and some ammunition, and the party now set out to penetrate a dense thicket, through which they struggled with great difficulty, until at the end of about 1 mile they came to a hill from which they could see the ocean. The pursuers were not to be seen beyond the reef, and they concluded that a passage had been found, and that the pilot boat was exploring the inlet for signs of the fugitives. Chapter 20. The party of the convicts, which consisted of 6 men besides Rashleigh and Roberts, had begun to look upon the steersman, whose capacity alone had made escape possible, as their captain and leader. The 6 men were in the main a tough and desperate gang. There was McClashin, a native of Belfast, who had earned an unenviable reputation among the convicts because he had, to save his own life, turned informer against 4 other men who were engaged with him in a robbery, with the result that they had all been hanged. Phelim Hennessy, a Tipperary man, had been transported for life for a crime then common in Ireland, known as carding a tithe proctor. He had used to boast of his bloody deeds done with the cool relish of the naturally bloodthirsty, and he had been suspected of 3 murders since his arrival in the colony, and had been transferred to Newcastle for a ruffianly assault upon an overseer. The remaining 4 men, Perkins, Shaw, Hanlon, and Owen, were neither better nor worse than the average run of convicts who had conducted themselves in such a way as to be finally assigned to the lime-burners' hell. Roberts had been a Nottingham boatman who had been transported for the demolition of machinery. He had, on arrival, been employed on one of the government boats at Sydney, and had been sentenced to 7 years at Newcastle for attempting to escape from the colony. These were the men who stood throughout the day anxiously watching the sea for signs of the pursuers. It was not until sundown that they at last saw the pilot boat standing out to sea, towing the boat they had so cunningly sunk that morning. Their mortification at seeing the means of their escape from the colony ignominiously disappearing from view turned into an outcry against Rashleigh, who had suggested the sinking of the vessel. He met their onset coolly, asking them in a contemptuous tone why themselves had not hit upon a better method of disposing of the boat. They all accepted his retort in silence, except Hennessy, who swore that it had been his opinion all along that the only way would have been to fight a passage through the reef, despite the soldiers. Roberts turned to him calmly. "If you think we can beat that lot on the pilot boat," he said, "it's not too late to have a belly full of fighting now. You can bet your boots that if we go down to the beach and show ourselves, the redcoats won't be backward at coming to have a slap at us." This silenced Hennessy, and the men fell to the discussion of the immediate problem of what should be done now. McClashin, Hanlon, and Hennessy were for turning inland until they came upon a settled part of Hunter River, and then, after robbing the settlers in the Wallace Plains neighbourhood, to go southward and join one of the bands of bushrangers who were terrorising the neighbourhood of the Hawkesbury River. Afterwards, said McClashin, they could seize some vessel at the mouth of the river and carry out their original plan of going to Timor Kupang. Rashleigh, his detestation of the bushrangers' life still warm, argued strongly against this project, and proposed that they should persevere even now in continuing along the beach, whether or not the crew of the pilot boat had found their stores. If they did, however, find any of the hidden tools, he maintained that they would be able to construct a serviceable, doable canoe from the first cedars they came across, and would thus be able to proceed on their northward journey without, as McClashin had proposed, making a journey overland of 500 miles to begin it all over again. The undecided men waited to hear what suggestion Roberts had to make, and it was obvious from their manner that the majority would willingly fall in with any plan he suggested. "Our way lies north," he said at last, with decision. "If only one man will go with me, I'll take the beach for it. But I think those of you who want to go the other way are fools, as you are sure to be grabbed before you get half the distance you're talking about. No, here we are so far on our journey. If we have the seaside, and we can't starve there as long as there's fish in the water. Besides, I've heard there's plenty of wrecked ships on this shore, and there's a chance we may find as good or even a better boat than the one we've lost." The three men, who had expressed no opinion at once, agreed to follow Robert's lead, making 5 for the plan and 2 against it. After trying for long to persuade Roberts to their way of thinking, McClashin and the other 2 agreed with bad grace to remain with the crowd. Mosquitoes made the night miserable, and the whole party were glad to get moving early next morning and discover whether the buried stores were still in their cache. They found them untouched, although all round were trampled bushes and other evidence of the rigorous search made by the pilot boat's party. Each man set about making some kind of knapsack in which to carry his portion of the load, and when this was done, the provisions, tools, 2 sails, and some cordage were equally parcelled out among them. They reburied a cask of water and a barrel of salt meat, with the intention of recovering them should they be successful in constructing a canoe at a reasonable distance. It was noon before their preparations to continue the journey were completed, and after a meal they started off along the sandy shore. It was slow and fatiguing going for weak and emaciated men, and by sunset they had covered only 6 miles. They were somewhat encouraged when they halted for the night to see a little inland, a hill on which, according to some of the men, cedars were growing. Perhaps at the end of another day's toilsome trudging they would be able to begin their experiment at canoe making. A little before they had come to a halt, Rashleigh had paused to rearrange his pack, so that the others had gone some distance ahead of him. As he was lifting his load onto his back, he fancied he saw a native black hiding in the bush near the beach. He looked more carefully and caught a glimpse of the black slinking away through the covert, as if unwilling to be seen. He mentioned what he had seen to Roberts when he came up with the group, and the leader at once decided to take what precautions they could. He decided to change the arrangements for the night, selecting an open place, free from thicket or other cover, and built big fires. Successive watches by each of the men in turn were decided upon. The evening hours passed without incident, but at dead of night the man on watch saw a number of dark forms wriggling across the sand surrounding the camp. At first he thought they were some kind of wild animals, but as they came within the glow of the fires, he saw that they were armed natives, who hoped to surprise the sleeping white men. The sentinel cautiously aroused the gang, and Roberts at once took charge. He whispered to the others to keep still, with their arms in readiness, until he gave the signal word, "Now," upon which they were to fire. The savages crawled forward until they were, in their own pidgin English, Murray close up, and then all lay motionless except their leader, who writhed forward a few yards, partially raised himself, and uttered a guttural monosyllable. This was apparently an intimation that their foes were asleep, for the savages resumed their crawling advance until they reached the packs, which the fugitives had thrown down in a circle around them. Then, with a yell that seemed to split the night, they leapt to their feet. "Now!" barked Roberts. The 8 muskets flashed and roared, accompanied by a fighting cheer from the white men. Several of the blacks fell, and the remainder, after an instant of paralysed surprise, bounded off towards the forest with the speed of kangaroos. Hennessy, annoyed by the screams of the wounded, walked up to each in turn and battered in their skulls. They had no more sleep that night, but sat watching the torches which the blacks now carried in the bush at a distance which betrayed their respect for the muskets. The moon rose. Towards morning, Roberts and another man scraped holes in the sand below high water mark and buried the corpses of the fallen natives, fearing that the sight of them in the daylight would stir their tribesmen to seek a dreadful revenge. At dawn, there was not a native in sight, and the band of runaways were able to enjoy their morning meal in peace. They immediately resumed their heavy march along the beach, coming after about 2 miles to a stretch which was overhung by cliffs. Rashleigh, realizing the danger of an ambush from overhead, suggested that one of the party should climb the nearest high rock to make sure whether the place was free of natives. Having heard many tales of the cunning of the Aborigines, and appreciating the disadvantage the party would be under if an attack was launched from the cliffs, his advice was overruled, the argument of the objectors being that it would be unwise for even one man to show himself conspicuously, as the enemy would almost certainly attack and kill him before his companions could get to the rescue. The march was therefore continued as near to the water's edge as possible, to keep out of range of ordinary native weapons. After walking half a mile, they came to a small bay, strewn with large boulders, about 1/4 of a mile across, beyond which the cliffs rose, almost from the tide mark. No sooner had the fugitives entered the bay, which was partially dry at low tide, when the silence was broken by the discordant battle yells of the Aborigines, a host of whom suddenly rose from behind rocks, flung their spears, and instantly dropped back into cover. The unwounded white men at once turned to fly in their tracks, but found another detachment of the cunning blacks brandishing spears right across their line of retreat. They were trapped between 2 bands, each of which outnumbered them. Roberts was lying with a spear through his leg, and Hanlon was down, struck by a waddy. The leader rose to his feet, broke off the protruding spear point, and pluckily pulled the shaft out of his flesh. "Don't be scared, my lads," he cried defiantly. "We'll beat those black vagabonds yet." Having launched their surprise attack, it seemed as if the blacks feared to show themselves as marks for the death-dealing muskets of the convicts. Roberts made for a flat-topped rock, standing a few yards away and about 8 feet high, and clambering onto it, took a quick survey of the position. He took in the worst danger spots ahead, came down and proposed to the others that they should fight their way through to a point where there was an overhanging ledge of rocks, beneath which they could be attacked only from the front. There was no choice but to agree. Hanlon, assisted by 1 man, was set in the centre of the desperate bunch of men, 4 of them walking with their faces towards their goal, and 3 walking backwards as the rear guard, all with their weapons at the ready. They suddenly came to the edge of a steep rift worn by a narrow torrent in which about 20 blacks were concealed. The surprise was mutual, and as the white men paused, the Aborigines dashed up the declivity, only giving their enemies time for 1 hurried volley. 6 blacks fell, but the remainder came unhesitatingly on and attacked hand to hand. The convicts gradually gained the ascendancy, their heavy clubbed muskets proving more effective weapons than the waddies of their opponents, who began to fall back with a view to reforming for a new assault. The whites took immediate advantage of the lull, reloaded their muskets, and, with a single murderous volley, turned the cautious retreat into a panic rush for the cover of the nearest rocks, leaving 13 dead or wounded. Of the convicts, Shaw had been killed, and Hanlon had taken a severe wound on the head. The remainder had no alternative but to rush for the place of vantage which Roberts had selected, dragging Hanlon with them. They had scarcely time to post themselves in positions to repel attacks when the Aborigines, screaming with fury and cries of vengeance, rushed upon them. The desperate men stood steady and with a carefully aimed volley brought down several of the attackers. There was an instant's pause, and then the remainder sprang forward, and in a few moments a wild hand-to-hand battle was in progress. The convict band set themselves back to the rock and crashed at the blacks with their clubbed guns. Rashleigh found himself facing 4 stout blacks, and hard put to it to keep them from killing him. He struck wildly at their legs and brought 2 of them down, and in lunging came a step forward from the rock. Instantly, one of his assailants caught him round the body and made to carry him out of the melee, but, dropping his musket, Rashleigh took out and opened his pocket knife and stabbed his captor repeatedly until he released him and fell. The yells for help of the fallen man were unheeded in the noise of the fight, and Rashleigh caught up his dropped musket and rained blows on the backs of the crowd of blacks who had got Roberts down. This unexpected attack from the rear caused the assailants to turn, giving Roberts the opportunity to rise and join Rashleigh in a final effort to repel their foes. Wearied by the fierce fight, the Aborigines gave way, and, seeing Rashleigh and Roberts reloading their death-dealing weapons, all of them who were still able turned and ran until they were out of sight. The convicts were at last in possession of their crude fortress, but they had gained it at the expense of 3 of their number killed outright, and all the others, except Rashleigh, wounded. 22 blacks, only a few of whom were killed, lay either unconscious or writhing with the pain of wounds on the ground adjacent to the overhanging rock. Hennessy, only slightly hurt, began at once to kill the wounded, and after a short period of natural revulsion, Rashleigh and Roberts decided that it was the kindest solution of the gruesome problem to join him in putting the wounded out of their sufferings. Chapter 21. The convicts had little cause for joy in their victory. Hanlon, Shaw, and Perkins had been killed. Roberts was dangerously wounded, Owen severely, and the 2 Irishmen were slightly hurt. The blacks, though repulsed for a time, were certain to renew the attack at the first chance, and would continue to harass them until they had avenged their dead. Another serious consideration was the procuring of water, the spot where they were being dry, and Roberts's condition alone made it impossible for them to move, while the chance of being ambushed in such an attempt compelled them to stay where they were. Rashleigh found himself blamed by McClashan and Hennessy as the prime cause of all the trouble and slaughter, because it had been on his advice that they had taken the route along the beach. They would hardly listen to his counter-assertions that they would have been equally open to attack from the Aborigines, whichever direction they might have taken. And as he turned from them, realizing the hopelessness of talk, Hennessy raised his musket and took aim. Roberts, unable to intervene actively, owing to his wounds, shouted a warning. Rashleigh turned instantly and rushed at Hennessy, just as by good luck the musket misfired. He wrenched the gun from the Irishman's hands, and lifting him bodily with the strength of anger, flung him to the ground. He stood over him while Hennessy begged for mercy, and then, with a contemptuous gesture, turned away to minister to Roberts's wounds. The leader seemed to be sinking fast from loss of blood, from 4 spear wounds and the pain of the many contusions on his head and body. Rashleigh carefully pulled out the stumps of the spears, which were still in the wounds, bandaged them as well as he was able with the scanty material he had, and then carried Roberts to a nook where he could lie undisturbed. His next concern was to reconnoitre their position and to find water. He stole cautiously from the little fastness, carrying his loaded musket, but he saw no sign of the Aborigines, nor for some time did he find any trace of water. At last, however, in a cleft at the foot of the cliff, he came upon an aquatic-looking plant, around which the soil was moist. He scraped out a hole with a stick and noticed that it began to fill with liquid, which proved to be pure water. He managed to get a small supply into a quart pot, which he had brought with him, and, having first greatly enlarged the hole, hurried back to Roberts with the water. The leader drank it gratefully, and the other men clamoured for a drink, taking with an ill grace Rashleigh's explanation that it must be some little time before enough water for them all could percolate into his primitive well. He then set about removing the corpses that still lay upon the floor of their retreat, dragging them to a hole in the rocks and covering them with sand. He next proceeded to make the place as secure as possible, driving stakes into fissures in the rocks and interlacing the ropes which they had brought from the boat, until he had made a rough cheval de frise, or hedge, with shiny bows fastened in amongst the strands of rope. This would, he thought, serve as some sort of protection from a sudden attack, and keep the blacks off long enough, at any rate, to give the fugitives time to reload their muskets. This task finished, he went off and fetched in a supply of drinking water, and prepared some food, which neither Roberts nor Owen, however, was able to eat. McClashen and Hennessy very readily shared the meal, and made an obvious pretence of renewed friendliness, but Rashleigh noticed meaning and sinister glances passing between the two ruffians, and determined to be on his guard. Consequently, after they had finished eating, and he had attended to the comfort of the wounded men, he went in search of some safe place in which he could sleep alone. He came upon a fissure in a rock at some distance from their retreat, which was filled with seaweed thrown there by past storms, the upper layers of which were dry. Here he decided to spend the night, but before turning in, he took the precaution of giving one more look to the wounded men, and smoke a pipe with Roberts. He gathered up a great armful of dried seaweed for making easier the leader's couch, and went back to the fastness. As he approached, he heard voices talking in low, furtive tones, and recognizing them as McClashen's and Hennessy's, he quietly dropped the seaweed and crept forward until he was behind the rock in front of which they were seated. "I tell you, he's as strong as a bullock," he heard Hennessy saying, "and might be more than a match for the pair of us." He heard McClashen answer, "Well then, we must do the other thing, that's all." In which the two men rose and moved into the open cavern where the wounded men were lying. Puzzled as to the meaning of what he had overheard, Rashleigh retrieved his seaweed. Convinced that the two blackguards meant ill to himself, he entered the cavern warily, but found the Irishman sitting, chatting unconcernedly by the fire. "I see you've something to make a bed," said McClashen, indicating the seaweed. "Is there any more of it anywhere handy?" "Plenty on the beach," answered Rashleigh shortly. "Then we'll go and gather some," said Hennessy, and the two left the cavern together. As soon as they were well away, Rashleigh removed the flints from their muskets, and concealed all the other firearms except his own. He then made up a bed of seaweed for Roberts and Owen, filled and lit his pipe, and lay down beside his wounded companions, who soon fell asleep. McClashen and Hennessy returned, each with a load of seaweed. "Now with this, it's a good night we'll be passing," said McClashen, and as Rashleigh made no reply, he went on in a would-be friendly way. "What's the reason you won't speak to a body? Surely you ain't crabbed at us still? Because you had a few words with us today, are you? You mustn't mind me or Hennessy at all, for we are only a couple of foolish wild Irishmen." Hennessy laughed and swore. "By jabbers thin, I'm foolish enough anyway, for I'd quarrel with my best friend sometimes, but it's all over with me in a minute, and so it is." Rashleigh doubted the sincerity of both of them, but suppressed his impulse to tell them this, remarking instead that he was not angry, but only tired and very sleepy. "Fake's thin, and no wonder," said McClashen, "after the hullabaloo we have all been in this day. By my soul, I saw you stick that big black divil that was for hauling you off like a horse's head to a bonfire. Sure, that was neatly done. And then how you rattled the others about the skulls that were for killing poor Roberts. I will say, if you hadn't come back to help us, it's dead we should have all been, and God knows the whole of us may be yet." Rashleigh sensed the treachery behind the whining praises of McClashen, and decided to keep his wits sharpened and his senses alert, ready for whatever deed of stealthy violence the two Irishmen meditated. Despite all his determination, he found himself beginning to doze, so he rose and stole silently out of the cavern, unobserved in the darkness by the other two, who, he guessed, must have fallen asleep. He reached his lair, lay down comfortably amongst the seaweed, and slept deeply until morning. At daylight, he cautiously returned to the cabin and found all his companions still sleeping and his rough defences undisturbed. He at once set about the preparation of breakfast, and McClashen, awakening, offered to help him. At the sound of voices, Hennessy also got up and gave Rashleigh a greeting in a hesitating, furtive manner, which contrasted strongly with his assumed heartiness of last night. "And how did you sleep?" McClashen asked Rashleigh, as they were eating. "Well enough," Rashleigh answered, refusing to be drawn. "And I did so too," said the Irishman. "Only the musketeers were troublesome." This was the only indication the two ruffians gave that they were puzzled, and the rest of the day passed quietly, without any sign of a renewal of the attack by the blacks. Towards nightfall, leaving Hennessy on guard against the blacks, McClashen and Rashleigh went out to fish, returning to the cabin as soon as they had caught enough for 2 good meals. The 2 sick men ate a little and the broiled fish, and after doing what he could to ease their wounds by rebinding and cleaning, Rashleigh laid down to smoke his pipe beside Robert's, as on the previous night. Again he stole out to his secret sleeping place, but it was some hours before he finally fell into a dream-troubled slumber. He dreamed first that he was at home, as a boy, playing with his only sister, when, a childish quarrel occurring, she was suddenly changed into a hideous creature with demonic features which slightly resembled those of Foxley, the dead bushranger, who, grinning horribly, made as if to strangle the lonely sleeper. Next, he dreamt that he was at Marshall's cottage, paying successful court to Jane Bates, when the door was flung open and McClashen, accompanied by Hennessy, rushed in and shot the girl dead, and were dragging him out when he awoke oppressed by an indefinable sense of dread. Try as he would to fall asleep again, he could not. Fear of some calamity impending dominated his consciousness, until at last it drove him from his lair towards the cabin to see if anything were amiss there. As he came in sight of the opening, he was surprised to see the glow of a fire, which lit up the surrounding rocks for yards around. His first thought was that the blacks had surprised his sleeping companions, and, having set fire to his impoverished hedge, were lying in wait for the fugitives to emerge confused with sleep, to spear them before they were properly awake. He cocked his piece and crept stealthily forward, and saw McClashen stooping down to add fuel to the fire, while Hennessy was looking puzzled as he bent over the spot where Rashleigh had first lain down. A shiver ran down his spine as he realised the significance of their actions. "That beggar Rashleigh isn't anywhere in the damned place," he heard Hennessy say in a tone of baffled rage. "Well, never mind him now," answered McClashen. "We can do him in when he does come. Let's settle the other 2. Rashleigh stole quickly forward until he was quite close to Hennessy, who was now bending over Owen. There was a muffled shriek and the gleam of a blood-stained knife in Hennessy's hand, and before Rashleigh could act, the murder had been done. The Irishman rose and turned to find the muzzle of Rashleigh's musket within a yard of his head. His howl of terror was drowned by the noise of the report, and next instant the brains of the cold-blooded murderer were splattered in his accomplice's face. McClashen, who had not seen Rashleigh until that moment, was too surprised to offer effectual opposition, and the rescuer sent him crashing to earth with a terrific blow from the butt end of his gun. Rashleigh, appalled by the suddenness of the tragedy, watched the brief quivering of the fallen man's limbs until they became still, then fell violently sick. There he was alone, with 3, possibly 4 corpses around him, 2 of them dead by his own hand, and beyond the dim light of the fire the menace of countless hostile blacks. For some moments he stood retching, but, realizing the need of immediate self-control, he pulled himself together and made up the fire. By its light he was overjoyed to find that Roberts had not been attacked and was still alive. As he was about to speak to the horrified leader, he heard McClashen calling in a weak voice. He turned in amazement, as he believed the Irishman to be dead. He went over and bent down to hear what the man had to say, seeing as he did so the terrible nature of the wound he had inflicted. In low tones, McClashen, penitent in the face of death, told Rashleigh how he and Hennessy had proposed to kill all 3 of their surviving companions and cut off their heads and those of the 3 they had buried. They then intended, he said in a whisper, to take the heads back to Newcastle and give themselves up to the commandant, to whom their tale was to be that they had been forced against their wills by the dead men to join in the seizure of the boat, and that, taking advantage of an opportunity to seize the firearms, they had killed them out of hand. Thus they had hoped to gain their freedom, knowing that this had been the reward of many others for similar deeds. McClashan died before dawn. Rashleigh and Roberts remained unmolested in their retreat for several days, until the leader of the diminished gang had sufficiently recovered his strength to be able to walk. Although still very weak, he yielded to Rashleigh's entreaties to leave the place, the very air of which seemed to him to be polluted with the poison of sudden slaughter and murderous violence. Burying most of the tools, arms, and other stores in the sand, they set out again upon their toilsome and dangerous march, taking with them 2 muskets, ammunition, an axe, a cross-cut saw, and a small supply of provisions. Their intention still was to reach the distant cedars and try to construct a canoe, but Roberts being so feeble, it was 3 days before they had covered the 20 miles which brought them near the trees. They found that the cedars were growing upon an island in a narrow bay which formed the estuary of a very rapid river, and they were considerably exercised in mind as to how they were to negotiate the crossing of the stream. Rashleigh at length recalled Foxley's device for crossing the Nepean River. They therefore went for some distance upstream above the island and constructed a rough catamaran near a bend in the river. It was made of logs lashed together with wild vines, and after testing its strength, the 2 men dragged it to the water and boarded it, Rashleigh arming himself with a guide pole. Fortunately for them, the stream was shallow as well as swift, and Rashleigh was able to head the crude craft in the right direction by using his pole as on a punt, and in a few minutes they had landed safely on the island. Dense brushwood grew right down to the water's edge, and the cedars grew on the hilly centre of the small island. They saw with misgiving that the trees were of immense girth, and Rashleigh, with his timber-felling experience to guide him, doubted whether their saw was long enough to be of any real service in cutting down even the smallest of them. In any case, it would be some time before Roberts would have regained sufficient strength for such heavy labour, and it looked as though Rashleigh would have to resort to the lengthy and tedious process of chopping a tree through with the axe. The delicate state of Robert's health, however, made the first consideration the erection of a shelter against the weather. Rashleigh, eager for any occupation which would keep at bay the unpleasant thoughts connected with the recent tragedies, set to work, and in 3 days had built a fine hut, with wattle walls and a roof thatched with reeds. He now decided to leave Roberts in the shelter, which he returned to their little fastness to recover the buried tools which he would need for the construction of a canoe, and also as much of the cordage as he could carry. He crossed the stream one morning, leaving Roberts with strict injunctions to remain in the hut and so avoid any chance of being seen by wandering natives. As he was carrying nothing but his gun, Rashleigh was able to make such good speed that he reached the vicinity of his destination before the day was nearly done. He met no one on his route, but on nearing the scene of tragedy, he saw a dense column of smoke ascending from a spot which seemed to him to be the exact location of his last retreat. He climbed a tree which grew upon rising ground and saw a number of blacks on the beach in front of the cabin, obviously intent upon the solemnities of religious or probably funeral rites. He had heard that the Aborigines have a horror of remaining long near a place where any of their fellows have met with violent death, so he decided to wait patiently until they withdrew. Hour after hour went by, occupied by a succession of ceremonies and dances, and it was almost sundown before the blacks at last withdrew and Rashleigh felt it was safe to go forward. He shuddered at the evidences of the revolting rites which had been performed. The killed blacks had all been exhumed and reburied sitting or standing, in accordance with tribal custom, in a circle of pits dug above high tide mark, and in the centre of this primitive graveyard, posts had been set up upon which the heads of the dead white men were hung by the jaws, from which all the teeth had been extracted and carried off. In the orgy of vengeance, the bodies of the dead convicts had been dismembered, and portions of the remains placed upon each of the graves, and the unwanted parts flung heedlessly about the beach. Rashleigh, recovering from the first wave of horror which swept through him at the sight, determined that when the blacks revisited this charnel place, they should see no remains of his late companions over which to gloat. Foul and repugnant as the task was, he gathered all the mangled remains, piled them all together upon a huge pile of brushwood, and set fire to the ghastly pyre. Knowing that superstition would keep him immune from molestation by the Aborigines, he would sooner die than revisit that place after nightfall. He found the tools and other equipment where they had been hidden, and taking as much as he could carry, set out to reach the island before daybreak. It was, however, long after sunrise that he arrived to find Roberts still improving, but considerably alarmed at his long absence. They waited until Roberts was sufficiently strong to share in the work, and then selecting a stout cedar, which was not, after all, too thick for the use of the saw, they had it felled, the trunk severed to the length of a canoe, and the bark stripped in the course of a single day's work. They split the log in two by means of wedges, and then began the process of hollowing the two pieces by means of burning. They then shaped the prows and sterns of the two row canoes, but it was weeks before the work was finally completed, and the lashed canoes were safely launched upon the water. This heavy task done, by working unremittingly every hour of daylight, they then set about preparing their cordage, sails, and oars. Rashleigh noticed that the river had been falling lower during the period of their stay on the island, but Roberts took small account of this, remarking that so long as there was depth enough for them to go over the falls, over which the river debouched into the sea, there would be plenty of water in the ocean. The weather had become oppressive, and the sun was obscured by a faint yellow haze, and a weighty stillness seemed to lie upon the land. One morning, while the two men were busily at work upon the canoe, Rashleigh felt the little craft tremble, seemingly caused by a shuddering of the land against which it rested. Then came a moaning, rushing noise, which seemed to rise from the neighbouring mountains. Rashleigh paled, unaccountably frightened. "What's that dreadful noise, Roberts?" he asked nervously. "Only distant thunder," answered Roberts easily. "Thunder!" exclaimed Rashleigh, looking at the sky. "Thunder in a sky without a cloud? Good God, look!" Panic-stricken, he pointed widely to the bend of the river where, the awful moaning growing louder, a great bank of rushing water, seeming of fabulous height, came advancing with a rush towards the island. Roberts had scarcely time to raise his head to look at what Rashleigh pointed to, when men and canoes were engulfed and carried away in the sweeping, thundering flood. The cracking noise of the smashed canoes was the last thing Rashleigh remembered before losing consciousness. Chapter 22. Rashleigh returned to consciousness upon an arid beach on which he was lying surrounded by a horde of Aborigines. Immediately his eyes opened. A quarrel arose among the blacks, who had been busily employed in resuscitating him, the reason for which seemed to be a competition as to who should have the privilege of dragging him off. The quarrel seemed to be on the point of developing into an armed combat, when the sudden appearance of a single native caused all the contestants to fall quiet. The Aborigine whose arrival had had so dramatic an effect was one of the most terrible-looking human beings that Rashleigh had ever dreamed of seeing. His polished skull was bald, except for a narrow circle of sparse white hairs around the top, and his beard was luxuriant and long. One of his eyes was gone, and the socket showed raw and bloody, and the other seemed to be filmed over, and the whole surface of his face was scarred. His body was incredibly emaciated, and was also covered with terrible scars, and, even among a tribe renowned for uncleanliness, he was the filthiest specimen of them all. At his approach the others withdrew to a short distance from Rashleigh, who had been expecting every instant to be killed by one or other of the clubs which the quarrelling blacks had been swinging as if to give emphasis to their unintelligible arguments. As the ugly old man reached Rashleigh's side, absolute silence fell upon the horde, several of whom held their clubs still, brandished in the posture in which his coming had found them. Every one's gaze was fixed upon the decrepit savage. From these signs of respect and fear, Rashleigh guessed that he was one of those strange creatures called Karangees, of whom he had heard descriptions since his arrival in Australia. These men possessed singular power and influence over even the most untamed tribes, combining in their persons the character of doctor, priest, and magician, and everything seemed to confirm the prisoner's guess that this strangely scarred savage was the local Karangee, and one of great eminence among his kind. The ancient supported his tottering, enfeebled body, with a limb of a tree carried as a staff in one hand, and in the other he carried a green eucalyptus bough. At a motion of his hand, the blacks fell farther back and crouched together in a circle, while the Karangee tottered several times around Rashleigh, waving the eucalyptus, and chanting a dull, monotonous song, which seemed to be a repetition of 2 or 3 words only. At length he ceased his chant, and sat down at the head of his captive, who was watching his every motion with apprehension. The old man made some kind of speech, to which the now pacific audience listened with marked attention, acknowledging its end with a chorus of guttural grunts. His speech finished, the Karangee rose and took 3 more chanting turns round Rashleigh. 2 athletic tribesmen now came forward and helped him to his feet, indicating to him by signs that he was to walk with them. Resistance being out of the question, he did as he was bidden, and, supported by his 2 guides, reached the camp of the tribe, which was in a clearing in the forest land. It consisted simply of a number of small fires, beside each of which reposed the gins, wives, and dogs of the warriors, guarding the dillies, nets, which held the fishing tackle and such weapons as the men were not carrying with them. Rashleigh's guides, under the direction of the Karangee, led him to a resting place near the old man's 3 fires, to which, according to custom, he was entitled, along with the 3 gins, each of whom attended her separate fire. However many wives an Aborigine may possess, each of them has to maintain her fire and provide a portion of the food for her lord, it being the custom for the men to send their wives at dawn each day upon a foraging expedition, themselves sleeping or lounging until the return of their gins, whom they reward with caresses or blows according to the quantity of food brought in. At that time the Aboriginal women were treated as slaves by the men, who confined their energies to hunting kangaroo and opossum when they were not fighting. Rashleigh was placed on the ground, and one of the Karangee's gins supplied his guards with a quantity of cordage, which he surmised had been made of yarn spun from the filaments of bark. His arms were bound fast to his sides, and his feet were tied together in such a manner that he was unable to move, after which the guards withdrew, leaving him with the ancient and his attendant Jin. The old man again sat very close to his head, and started chattering at a great pace in a spate of words, not one of which his listener understood. Another Jin came up, bearing on a few fresh fern leaves, and apparently newly roasted fish. After a few words with her husband, she raised Rashleigh to a sitting position, tore the fish to pieces with her fingers, and began to feed him with morsels, which he enjoyed, despite the insipidity of their taste. The Jinn then held a calabash of water to his lips, and the strangely served meal ended. She then laid him again upon his back, covered him with a cloak of opossum skins, and told him, by use of signs, that he was expected to go to sleep, and despite his anxiety, he was soon in a deep slumber. He awoke in darkness to the monotonous noise of croaking frogs, and was unable to sleep again owing to the dull pains in his bound limbs. Before dawn, the Jinns departed on their hunt for food for their men, and a black came up to Rashleigh and loosened his bonds, motioning him to rise. He did as he was ordered, and saw that all the males of the tribe were assembled, fully armed, their faces and bodies fearfully smeared with yellow, white, and red earths. A procession was formed, headed by the old Korangi, supported by 2 strong tribesmen. A dozen warriors followed, waving green bows to and fro, chanting an incantation in low tones. Rashleigh came next between 2 guards armed with spear, shield, and wadi, and wearing their hair decorated fancifully with red and blue feathers among tufts of cotton grass. Bones were worn in their earlobes and in the cartilage of their noses. They were followed by another detachment carrying bows, and the rear was brought up by the body of about 150 fully armed warriors. The quaint procession went slowly forward until it reached an open green space which overlooked the sea. Rashleigh noticed that the sky was beginning to glow in the east, heralding the rising of the sun. A mound stood in the centre of the space in which they had halted, and on this he was placed in a sitting posture, facing the sea, while the warriors took up positions behind him and at his sides. The blacks who had carried bows now stuck them in their girdles behind them, with the leaves downward, so that they looked like tails, and began to execute a weird dance, the motions of which seemed to the watcher to derive from the action of the kangaroo. The Korangi, meanwhile, approached the prisoner, and placed before him a bundle made of opossum skins. Then he took a bow and waved it in a peculiar way above the bundle to the accompaniment of a muttered chant. This preliminary rite completed, he at length opened the mysterious bundle, which Rashleigh saw contained a number of single human teeth, an instrument made of green talc resembling a chisel, and a flat, irregularly shaped stone. At a gesture from the ancient, 2 warriors seized Rashleigh's arms, and the Korangi's expression became so demoniacal that he was sure his end was imminent. The man's actions, however, made it clear that death was not to be immediate. The magician took up the chisel and the stone instrument, and, speaking with patent earnestness, approached Rashleigh, making signs as if he wished him to open his mouth. He did as he appeared to be bidden, and the old man placed the chisel edge against one of his front teeth, looking out across the ocean as he did so. At that instant the rim of the sun appeared above the horizon, and, as if that were a sign, the Korangi struck the chisel sharply with the stone, forcing out the tooth. The whole company broke into a loud shout at this, and the tooth was handed round from hand to hand for inspection, each man making a motion as if to spit upon it. It was then restored to the Korangi, who solemnly placed it in the bundle with the other teeth, and tied it up with a great show of ceremony. A dance by the unarmed men, known as a corroboree by colonists, followed, the warriors accompanying the dancers with shouts and clashing of weapons, and as the dance ended, Rashleigh was seized and laid face downwards upon the ground, held there, as it seemed to him, by half the tribe. He had scarcely time to wonder what the next strange happening would be, when he felt several gashes inflicted on the flesh of his back, and resigned himself with composure to his now certain fate. Being indurated to torture of this kind by the hundreds of lashes he had endured on Emu Plains and Coal River, he had no outward sign of the pain the gashes caused. He was quickly turned over to lie on his bleeding back, and saw that each of the dancers carried a small sharp shell crimsoned with his blood. These tormentors, glaring furiously at him, stooped down and gashed the front of his body, while a great yell went up from the assembly. He was instantly raised from his recumbent position, and saw that he had 2 rows of 9 gashes between the shoulders and the bottom ribs, and guessed that the same number had been made upon his back. Blood was flowing from the wounds, and he could feel it trickling warmly down his body and legs. After another dance, the Korangi came up to him with a shell full of some sticky preparation, with which he carefully anointed all the wounds, which almost at once stopped bleeding. Rashleigh was then placed on a litter made of boughs, hoisted upon the shoulders of 4 tribesmen, and the procession returned to camp in much the same order as they had left it, except they went with a great shouting and beating of waddies against their shields, and parties breaking into dances, wild as a horde of furies. At the camp, the gins were all assembled roasting fish, roots and grubs, and excitedly making preparations for a great feast. 2 of them were busily pounding some condiment between stones, transferring the mash to a calabash. The men squatted in a wide circle, Rashleigh being placed next to the Korangi, and immediately the women served out broiled roots and fish, and by way of a delicacy, some of those great grubs found in rotten timber, well roasted. The ancient ate very little himself, but continually passed over his share to Rashleigh, who now began to feel more hopeful about his future. In spite of his desire to create a good impression, he found himself unable to eat anything but the fish, and even this, eaten without salt, he found rather insipid in taste. At intervals the gins handed round calabashes filled with a hot, moderately sweet drink, but they were not allowed to sit or join in the revelry, and as soon as the feast was finished the women withdrew, nor did Rashleigh see a single gin during the rest of the day. After the women had departed, the calabash containing the roots which the 2 gins had been pounding was handed to the Korangi, who divided up the contents into a great many portions, which were put into smaller calabashes. These were then filled with water, and the mixture heated by means of red-hot stones placed in the vessels. The hot liquor was then drunk from shells, dipped into the calabashes, and then Rashleigh tasted some. It reminded him of fermented Spanish licorice, except there was a pungent acridity which clung to the palate after the liquor had been swallowed. Practically, the whole tribe became speedily intoxicated, dancing, shouting, fighting, and singing for several hours, until when at last Rashleigh was able to wrap himself in an opossum rug and lie down to sleep, the whole assembly of savages were strewn about, dead drunk. The next day, Rashleigh, despite the fact that he had been abstemious, suffered all the after-effects of a heavy night's debauch, but his case was enviable compared with that of the majority of blacks, who looked literally half dead from the potent liquor. The old Korangi seemed to suffer more than any, lying in a torpor, with his head pillowed in the lap of his favourite gin, who served him at intervals throughout the day with cooling drink. A few days after the feasting, Rashleigh's wounds began to cicatrize, and over each gash a wavy scar was thick as his middle finger had formed. The old wizard now gave him a quantity of dark-coloured pigment, telling him by signs to anoint his skin with it. He did as he was ordered, repeating the operation daily for about a fortnight, and at the end of which his whole body, with the exception of the palms of his hands and the soles of his feet, was stained a dull dark hue. The chief now gave him what appeared to be a ball of suet to rub over his skin, which deepened and fixed the colour, and in the end Rashleigh might easily have passed as a native. The Korangi's next move, for the comfort of the adopted stranger, was to present him with a gin, as well as a quantity of native weapons, the two men always eating together and sleeping a few yards apart. He commanded one of the black warriors to instruct Rashleigh in the mysteries of savage life, and in this way he learnt the various methods of hunting food and spearing fish. He was well content to fall in with the destiny which fate had so strangely put upon him, convinced as he was that it was safer and better than what awaited him if he returned to live among white men. He therefore applied himself with eager goodwill to mastering everything that his black preceptor had to teach him, and soon became as efficient and dexterous as anyone who was not a native could hope to be. During the 4 years which he spent in this state of contented barbarism, his life was steady and uneventful. In the mornings his gin, named Laura, went out to fish and dig roots like any other black's wife, whilst he went off to hunt for bandicoots or kangaroo rats. His hunting was varied, if he chanced to meet with a goanna or an opossum, which he pursued in native fashion, cutting notches in the trunk of the tree which he climbed until the creature was perched on a slender bough incapable of taking the weight of a man. He would then cut the small branch through with his stone axe, so that the quarry fell to earth, where it remained either killed or too maimed to move until he slithered down and captured it, taking it back to camp as a dish for breakfast. Often his pack of half-wild dogs accompanied him, chasing bandicoot or kangaroo rat until it took refuge in some hollow log, when, instead of cutting it out, Rashleigh would plug up one end of the hollow with clay and set fire to the other end, causing the animal to choose between being suffocated or running the gauntlet of the dogs, which he never knew to fail to make a kill. He had mastered woodcraft, and, however far through the dense bush his hunting might take him, he had all the native's gift for finding his way unearily back to camp. By the time he returned, Laura would have ready the cleaned roots, boiled or roasted, and the Korangi's other gins would have prepared fish, and to these would be added whatever Rashleigh had brought back from the morning's hunt. He had taught the gins something of the white man's art of cleanliness and preparation of food, and he would sit down with the Korangi and the gins to better cooked food than was usual to aborigines. The rest of the day, until the evening, was spent in lazing in the shade, until hunger brought him and his protector to the second and last meal of the day, punctually prepared by the women. There were night fishing expeditions made to secluded bays and inlets at which, accompanied by gins bearing torches of resinous bark, Rashleigh and the other men, armed with spears, would wade into the water up to their waists, while the fish, attracted by the glare of the torches, swam round them. It was an easy matter to spear them in the shallows, and the gins returned to camp heavily laden with the catch. At least once every winter, when the stripping of the undergrowth of foliage made the bush penetrable, a great hunt was organised. All the camp dogs were got together and leashed, and a circle of several miles was selected for beating. The blacks advanced with yells and a great beating of instruments, blowing on conch shells, with every noise that could contribute to the general pandemonium. The wild animals retreated as the noise came near them, and when nightfall came, the tribe encamped and slept with a strong guard to drive back any beasts that might try to escape. At daybreak, the blacks resumed their converging advance until the time came when the circle had diminished in size until not more than 6 yards separated the men. Then the more expert hunters, unleashing all the dogs, beat forward into the thicket in which the animals were imprisoned, forcing them to fly from the covert in a panic, to be slaughtered by the spears and waddies of the waiting hunters. The game was carried back to camp, and at night a great feast was held with the vast quantities of food. Liquor made from roots and a kind of mead prepared from honey was consumed in unlimited quantity, and the feast usually ended in wild drunken quarrels, as apt as not to end fatally in some instances, and the gradual subsiding of the whole tribe into the deep sleep of intoxication. Rashleigh soon acquired a competent knowledge of the simple language of the Aborigines, the vocabulary of which was limited to the few words which were necessary to make intelligible the simplest ideas. He discovered that they had no form of religion, but were ridden by superstitions of the supernatural, chiefly concerned with the ghosts of slain warriors transformed into malignant demons, whose hobby was to kill women and children, and any warriors whom they came upon defenceless or asleep. Many spots were under a taboo of terror from this cause, the blacks believing them to be the haunts of goblins, who had been seen in demoniacally terrifying shapes by various unlucky and imaginative natives. There was one superstition, the foundation of which he never learnt. Once the natives had lain down for the night, nothing would induce them to leave their fires, even if they were dying down, and they would never build a fire with large logs, which could be depended upon to last through the night. Never in all his stay with them did he see faggots used which were thicker than a man's wrist, which was the ultimate measure used for determining the sticks to be used for fuel. Such government as the natives had was a kind of patriarchal despotism, all the power being vested in the old Korangi. He had won his position, so far as Rashleigh was able to discover, by the great feats of war which he had performed in his younger days, and he maintained it in his decrepitude by imposing upon his ignorant subjects by dexterity as a conjurer. One of the instances which Rashleigh witnessed of the old man's use of his power concerned his own gin. Laura, who had been the old Korangi's favourite before she was given to Rashleigh, complained one day to the old man that Jumba, a powerful black, had beaten her because she had quarrelled with one of his wives while they were digging roots. The old magician worked himself up to a high pitch of fury as he listened to her tale and ordered Jumba to be brought before him. The warrior listened humbly to the storm of virulent abuse which the angry Korangi poured out at him, and attempted to justify his conduct by throwing the whole blame upon Laura, maintaining that she had irritated him past endurance by her scolding tongue. This defence was listened to coldly by the old man, who simply addressed 3 words to Jumba: "Begone and whither." Rashleigh, not understanding the sentence, asked Laura what was meant, and learnt from her that it meant literally that the delinquent had been condemned to pine away and die. She told him of several cases of men actually wasting away and dying under this sentence, saying that the only ones who recovered after its pronouncement were those whom the Korangi had forgiven. At first Rashleigh attributed this to mere credulity on the part of the girl, but later he saw that there was truth in what she had told him. The old magician was medicine man to the tribe, with a wide knowledge of herbs and drugs, and his method was to administer harmful stuff with his victim's food, or in potions which he gave him to drink, which, if not actually killing him, induced painful and lingering sickness. The belief in the efficacy of the sentence held by the natives was evidenced in this case by Jumba, who, on hearing sentence pronounced, broke out into noisy lamentations, tore the fastenings and feathers from his hair, and cut severe gashes all over his body. He and his 2 gins, crying wildly to the Korangi for mercy. In despair, Jumba and his women withdrew, and for a week, during which they were shunned by the whole tribe as completely as if they had been placed in quarantine, the man lay in a state of dispirited dejection. Deaf to the consolations of his gins, believing utterly that his doom was inevitable unless the ban were lifted, Laura herself continually petitioned the old man to forgive Jumba, and at last he yielded to her importunity of mercy, and signified the lifting of the sentence by sending to Jumba the hind quarter of a fine kangaroo. Graver offences such as murder or the theft of a jinn within the tribe were punished by a verdict of the General Council of all the warriors belonging to the sept of the tribe, who, according to the gravity of the case, sentenced the offender to have a certain number of spears thrown at him. On the day fixed for the carrying out of the sentence, all the warriors were assembled just before sunrise at the place where Rashleigh had been put through his ceremony of initiation. The accused, black, naked and unarmed, but carrying a shield, was placed upon the mound, and the nearest relative of the murdered man, or the aggrieved person, stood at 70 paces from the prisoner. Immediately the sun's rim appeared above the horizon. The first spear was thrown, followed by 2 or 3 more, according to the number specified in the sentence. The culprit defended himself as best he could with his shield. Every warrior assembled then, in turn, discharged the same number of spears, which completed the sentence. Whether the man died or survived, it was forbidden ever again to speak of his offence. Rashleigh was astonished at the dexterity with which these natives defended themselves with the shield, which varied from 8 inches to a foot in width. In several instances he had seen criminals ward off a succession of as many as 300 spears and escape with only 4 or 5 leg wounds. As the sentence for crimes of unusual atrocity, it was ordered that 21 warriors should simultaneously throw a spear at the culprit, which was equivalent to being condemned to death. The Aborigines were adept at spear throwing, the majority being able to strike a small bird at 100 paces, and with force enough to penetrate as much as 4 inches into the trunk of a tree. There was consequently no hope for the most expert shieldsmen to meet or turn a flight of spears flung by a picked band of warriors. Rashleigh saw no man condemned to this punishment escape with his life. The Aborigines, he found, mated without any kind of marriage ceremony. As soon as the youth had undergone his initiation by gashes and was declared a grown man, his first use of his weapons was to hunt for a wife. He would steal unseen towards some swamp near which another tribe was located, and lie there all night, waiting until at dawn the young jinns came to search for food. His attention would be riveted upon the girls, whose headdress showed them to be unmarried, and selected one whose capture opportunity made easy. He would pounce upon her and bear her struggling and screaming away. If he succeeded in carrying her to the camp before any of her male relatives could rescue her, she became his bride by capture, and was never more owned by her tribe, nor allowed to enter its camp again. It was a point of honour or habit among the girls always to resist capture to the utmost of their strength, biting, kicking, and scratching their captors, and it was similarly habitual for the man to beat the struggler about the head, body, and limbs with blows that were calculated surely to break her gallant resistance. Often Rashleigh saw the couples arrive, the girl hanging insensible over the man's back, and he with blood streaming from the rents made by her teeth and nails. It was a rough fashion in courtship, to which the only exceptions were cases such as the old Korangi, who, being too feeble to man his own jinn, was obliged to deputy a younger man to carry out the rigorous abduction. There was always competition for this position of deputy, as virtue was supposed to derive from undertaking the task for persons of supposed supernatural power. The death of a warrior, especially of one in his youth or prime, was regarded as a calamity by the whole tribe, whose custom was to cut great gashes in their flesh as evidence of the grief which they expressed with loud and continuous wailing. The death of a chief or of a Korangi was attended by many superstitious ceremonies and observances, while the death of women, children, and uninitiated youths was completely disregarded. The name of the dead was never again mentioned after burial, the form of which was a sitting posture for warriors, standing erect for great chiefs, and women and children were buried lying face downwards. Oval-shaped mounds, sometimes planted with aromatic shrubs, marked the graves.